Hey guys. Tonight, dim the lights. Put the phone face down. Get comfortable, because we're drifting gently out to sea. Not the romantic, sunset on the horizon kind of sea. More the damp, splintery, smells like old fish kind. Tonight, we're talking about pirate ships, and more specifically, how women survived on them, and why almost no one wanted them there in the first place. So settle in, loosen your shoulders, and let your brain slowly power down while we float through one of history's least relaxing workplaces. Now, when people imagine pirates, they usually picture swagger. Boots on deck, wind in the hair, maybe a dramatic coat flapping for no reason. What they do not picture is hygiene, or privacy, or personal space, or a functioning bathroom. Which is important, because pirate ships were, in technical terms, absolute nightmares. Most pirate vessels were small, crowded, cramped, and stuffed with men who had not bathed recently, or soberly, or willingly. You slept where you could, often on deck, sometimes near cannons, occasionally next to rats who had been there longer than you. This was not a place designed for comfort. It was barely designed for survival. And into this environment, occasionally, women appeared. Not often, not comfortably, and usually under very specific circumstances. So let's start with the most obvious question. Why were women so rare on pirate ships? The short answer is superstition. The long answer is misogyny, fear, logistics, and a complete lack of planning. Sailors, pirates included, were deeply superstitious. They believed the ocean had moods, that ships could be cursed, that storms were personal. And women, unfortunately, were often blamed for upsetting the sea. There was a persistent belief that having a woman aboard would anger the ocean, that she would distract the crew, that jealousy would follow, that fights would break out, that discipline would crumble, which is ironic because pirate discipline was already flexible. But the belief stuck. Women were considered bad luck. Unless, of course, they were naked statues carved into the front of the ship. Those were fine. Apparently, the sea respected tasteful nudity. Real women, however, were a problem. Beyond superstition, there was also the issue of violence. Pirate ships were not safe places. They were lawless by design. There were rules, yes, but those rules were written by men, for men, and enforced inconsistently. Bringing a woman aboard meant acknowledging the possibility of sexual violence, which pirate captains, to their credit, sometimes tried to avoid. Not because they were progressive, but because violence within the crew caused mutiny, and mutiny was bad for business. So many pirate crews had explicit rules banning women entirely. No women, no boys, no exceptions. Of course, rules are only as strong as the men breaking them, and women still ended up on ships. Some were captives, some were passengers taken during raids, some were disguised, some were stubborn, some were desperate, and some were pirates themselves. But before we get to the famous names, let's talk about the ordinary women, the ones history barely recorded. Because if you were a woman on a pirate ship, chances are you were not there voluntarily. Many women were taken during coastal raids. Pirates attacked port towns, fishing villages, trading ships. They took food, money, clothes, and sometimes people. Women could be held for ransom, or sold, or forced to serve the crew. Service meant cooking, cleaning, sewing, or tending wounds, which sounds mild until you remember the setting. Cooking meant working over open flames on a rocking deck. Cleaning meant scrubbing blood out of wood with seawater. Sewing meant repairing sails soaked in salt and rot. And tending wounds meant seeing things you did not want to see. Infections, amputations, gunshot wounds treated with alcohol and optimism. And that was on a good ship. Pregnancy was another issue no one planned for. There was no maternity leave at sea, no midwife, no privacy. If a woman became pregnant aboard a pirate ship, it was a crisis. Some captains put women ashore at the nearest port. Others forced abortions using methods best described as reckless. Some simply pretended it wasn't happening. Childbirth at sea was extremely dangerous for the mother, for the child, for everyone listening. Babies cried. Crying attracted attention. Attention attracted Navy ships. So infants were rare, and survival was not guaranteed. Which brings us to a strange paradox. Pirates didn't want women on ships, but they also couldn't fully avoid them. And when women did stay aboard long term, they usually had to adapt in extreme ways. One of those ways was disguise. Some women cut their hair, bound their chests, dressed as men, not as a performance, but as armor. On a pirate ship, appearing male was safer. It meant access to weapons. It meant less scrutiny. It meant a chance to be treated as a crew member rather than property. But it also meant constant vigilance. No changing clothes in public, no bathing with others, no medical care without exposure. Injuries were dangerous. Illness was terrifying, because discovery could mean expulsion, or punishment, or worse. And yet, some women managed it for years. They swore, they drank, they fought. They became pirates. Which leads us, gently, calmly, to the women history actually bothered to remember. Anne Bonny and Mary Read. You knew we'd get here eventually. Anne Bonny was born around 1700. Irish by birth, troubled by personality. She grew up in the Caribbean, already a chaotic setting, and she did not enjoy being told what to do. She married badly, as was tradition. Her husband was a small-time pirate and informant, which is an awkward combination, and Anne quickly decided she hated him. So she left. She joined a pirate crew led by Calico Jack Rackham, a man remembered primarily for his fashion sense and poor life choices. Anne dressed as a man aboard ship. She fought, she swore, she drank. And at some point, she discovered that another pirate, Mary Read, was also a woman in disguise. Mary Read's life was complicated. Her mother dressed her as a boy from childhood to receive inheritance money, because medieval and early modern inheritance laws were nothing if not unhelpful. Mary lived as a man for most of her life. She served in the military. She worked various jobs. By the time she became a pirate, the disguise wasn't even new. It was just efficient. Anne and Mary reportedly fought alongside the men. They were not mascots. They were not novelties. They were crew. And when Calico Jack's ship was attacked, Anne and Mary fought while most of the men hid below deck, which is one of those moments history quietly enjoys. Eventually, the crew was captured, and here's where things get very historically bureaucratic. Anne and Mary were sentenced to death, as pirates, as criminals, but both claimed pregnancy. This was called pleading the belly, and it worked. Execution was postponed, because killing a pregnant woman meant killing an unborn child, and even pirate law had lines. Mary Read died in prison, probably from fever. Anne Bonny disappeared. No records, no execution, no grave. Which means historians argue, and YouTubers speculate, and everyone fills in the silence. But their story, as dramatic as it is, was not typical. Most women on pirate ships did not become legends. They survived quietly, or briefly. Some became informal partners to captains, protected but isolated. Some were abandoned at ports. Some were killed in raids. Some vanished into records labeled simply woman. There were also pirate ships that deliberately included women. Rare, but not impossible. These ships often operated more like floating communities, with families aboard, children, shared labor. They were slower, more aggressive, more defensive, and less likely to survive encounters with naval forces. Because the golden age of piracy was not forgiving. Navies hunted pirates relentlessly, captured crews were hanged publicly, bodies displayed as warnings. Women were sometimes spared execution, sometimes imprisoned, sometimes released, sometimes ignored entirely by history. Which brings us to another reason women were rare.
Piracy was short. The average pirate career lasted only a few years. Many died young. Many were executed. Many disappeared. It was not a lifestyle that supported long-term survival, let alone families. So women who wanted stability avoided it, and women who ended up aboard were often there by force or circumstance. And yet, despite everything, some survived. They learned the rhythms of the ship. They learned when to speak, when to disappear, when to fight. They adapted. Not romantically, not heroically, but practically. Which is usually how real survival looks. As we drift forward, we'll keep meeting these women, captives, disguised sailors, partners, outliers. And we'll also talk about what happened when pirate ships returned to land.
All right, let's just drift onward from where we left off. No sharp turns, no sudden excitement. Same ship, same creaking wood, same questionable life decisions. Because once a woman ended up on a pirate ship, the real question wasn't how did she get there, it was what role did the crew decide she was allowed to survive in, and that role was rarely chosen by her. For most women, survival at sea depended entirely on proximity to power, not strength, not courage, not intelligence, just whether one specific man decided you were useful enough to protect. Pirate ships liked to imagine themselves as democratic spaces with articles of agreement and shared loot and votes for captains. And yes, sometimes that was true, but those rules usually stopped applying the moment a woman entered the picture. Many women became what historians politely call companions. This could mean a long-term sexual partner to a captain or senior officer, or it could mean something far more transactional and far less stable. Protection in exchange for exclusivity, safety in exchange for silence. It was not romance, it was logistics. Being attached to a captain came with certain advantages. You were less likely to be assaulted by the rest of the crew. You might get slightly better food, a little privacy if the ship even had a spare corner to offer. But it also meant complete dependence. If the captain was killed, captured, or voted out, which happened more often than people like to imagine, your protection vanished instantly. And pirate crews were not known for honoring emotional attachments after leadership changes. The sea has no patience for grief, and neither did sailors. Some women avoided this fate by making themselves indispensable in other ways. Cooking was one. Sewing was another. Sail repair was constant work, and anyone who could handle needle and canvas was valuable. Medical knowledge, even basic herbal remedies or wound cleaning, could buy a woman temporary respect. Pirates were reckless, but they were not eager to die of infections if someone on board knew how to reduce the smell alone. Still, usefulness was a fragile shield. One injury, one argument, one shift in crew mood, and a woman could go from protected to expendable very quickly. Which is why disguise remained one of the most effective survival strategies. Women who successfully passed as men were often treated better than women who were openly female. This says less about pirate equality and more about pirate priorities. A man was assumed to be able to fight, drink, swear, and take punishment without complaint. A woman was assumed to be a liability. So, women who removed themselves from that category gained a strange kind of freedom. But it was exhausting. Constant performance, constant vigilance, a wrong movement, a shared bottle, a wound in the wrong place, and everything could unravel. And medical care was particularly dangerous. Pirate surgeons were not gentle people, and they were not discreet. An injury that required treatment could expose everything. There are records of women discovered this way, sometimes after years at sea, and the reactions varied wildly. Some crews expelled them at the next port. Some allowed them to stay, quietly adjusting their expectations. Some punished them for deception, as if survival itself were a crime. It depended on the ship. It always depended on the ship.
What's important to remember is that pirate life was unstable by nature. Ships changed crews constantly. Men died, men deserted, men were captured. Women who survived did so through reading situations quickly and adapting without hesitation. There was no long-term plan, only the next week, sometimes only the next day. And then there were the women who never truly became part of the ship at all. These were captives taken during raids, merchant wives, daughters, sometimes servants. They were held temporarily, often under horrifying uncertainty. Ransom was a common goal. Families on shore might pay to have women returned safely, assuming safely was still an option. Other times, women were dropped off at ports once they were no longer considered useful or profitable. There was no standardized outcome. Some women were released unharmed, some were assaulted, some disappeared from records entirely. Piracy, for all its myths, was rarely glamorous for anyone who chose it. Pregnancy, when it occurred, complicated everything. A pregnant woman was a logistical problem pirates had no interest in solving. Ships were not equipped for childbirth. There was no privacy, no clean water, no sterile tools. Childbirth at sea was dangerous even on legitimate vessels. On pirate ships, it was a nightmare scenario. Most pregnant women were put ashore if possible. If not, the outcomes were grim. Infant mortality was high, maternal mortality was higher, and surviving children were almost never kept aboard for long. A crying baby was a liability no pirate wanted. Which is why stories of pirate families, while fascinating, are extremely rare. Piracy did not support domestic life. It barely supported life at all. When pirate ships returned to land, women faced a different set of dangers. Ports were not safe havens. Many were hostile to pirates and anyone associated with them. Women could be arrested simply for being present. Others were abandoned without money or support in foreign cities, expected to survive on their own. Some women returned to anonymity. They remarried. They lied. They erased years of their lives. Others were imprisoned alongside pirates, especially if they were suspected of active participation. Legal systems did not always distinguish between crew member and captive. Being on the ship sometimes was enough. And yet, despite all of this, women kept appearing in pirate history, quietly, briefly, often only as footnotes. Which brings us back, gently, to the famous ones, because Anne Bonny and Mary Read were not anomalies because they were women. They were anomalies because they were recorded. Their survival, their fighting, their identities were written down, repeated, and preserved. Countless others lived similar lives without leaving names behind. The truth is, pirate women survived on pirate ships the same way pirates survived it all, through constant adaptation, uncomfortable compromises, and a willingness to endure conditions most people would flee from immediately. They were rare, not because women were incapable, but because piracy was an ecosystem that actively discouraged their presence at every level. And as we continue drifting forward, we'll start to see how the myth of the pirate woman grew larger than the reality, how later centuries romanticized what was, in practice, a life defined by uncertainty, exhaustion, and very little choice. So stay relaxed, let the waves keep moving. We'll keep floating through this strange corner of history, where survival mattered far more than legend, and silence often tells us more than the stories that survived.
All right, let's keep going. Same pace, same tide. No rush, just drifting forward, letting the ship creak underneath us, while history slowly blurs at the edges. Because by the time piracy starts fading as a real, lived experience, something else begins to grow in its place, the myth. And for women especially, the myth becomes much louder than the reality ever was. Once the so-called golden age of piracy began to end in the early 18th century, governments cracked down hard. Navies expanded, trade routes were protected, ports became less welcoming. Piracy went from a risky career to a near-certain death sentence. And as the real pirates disappeared, people started filling the silence with stories. This is where pirate women slowly transform from survivors into symbols. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who in real life were just two people trying to survive an unstable and violent world, became exaggerated into fearless icons, romanticized, simplified. Their hunger, fear, illness, and constant stress were gently edited out. What remained was bravery, rebellion, and a sense of freedom that most pirates never actually experienced. And because there were so few recorded women, every story about them was stretched thin, retold endlessly, and polished smooth. Suddenly, pirate women were portrayed as exceptions, almost supernatural figures who broke rules effortlessly. The disguise was clever, the fighting was glamorous, the danger was thrilling. In reality, most women associated with pirate ships did not feel empowered. They felt trapped, or tired, or alert every waking moment, because one mistake could cost everything. But that version doesn't sell particularly well. As the centuries passed, writers and historians, mostly men because of course, began to project modern fantasies backward. Pirate women became proof that piracy was somehow progressive, that ships were spaces of equality, that gender barriers dissolved at sea. This is, to put it gently, optimistic. Pirate ships were not feminist utopias, they were desperate environments. Any flexibility they showed was driven by necessity, not ideology. If a woman could fight, she fought. If she could sew, she sewed. If she could pass as a man, she did. Not because the crew believed in equality, but because survival demanded efficiency. And when survival no longer demanded it, tolerance often vanished. Many women who survived piracy did everything possible to distance themselves from it afterward. They changed names, they avoided ports where they were known, they did not boast about their time at sea. Because on land, being associated with pirates was dangerous, especially for women. Courts did not care about nuance. A woman found with pirates could be assumed complicit. Some were imprisoned, some were punished socially, even if not legally. Others were quietly absorbed back into ordinary life, carrying stories they never told. There are hints of this everywhere in historical records. Women listed simply as present, women questioned but not charged, women released without explanation. Their lives continue in fragments, if at all. And this silence is important, because silence tells us that for many women, survival meant being forgettable, not standing out, not becoming legendary, just getting through it and disappearing back into the background as quickly as possible. Even on pirate ships themselves, women who survived long-term often did so by being unobtrusive, not drawing attention, not challenging authority unless necessary, not becoming symbols. This is the opposite of how piracy is usually portrayed, but it's far closer to how humans actually behave in unstable environments. Another thing the myth tends to ignore is age. Pirate women were not always young, daring figures. Some were older. Some had already lived hard lives before piracy ever entered the picture. Widowhood, poverty, displacement, these were common paths that pushed women into proximity with pirates, not adventure, not rebellion, just limited options. And those options narrowed quickly. As piracy declined, women who had relied on pirate networks lost what little protection they had. Some turned to port economies, taverns, lodging houses, laundry, informal trade. Others ended up in institutions, prisons, workhouses, convents. The sea did not leave them with transferable skills that society valued. Fighting with a cutlass did not translate well to stable employment, which makes the later romanticization even stranger, because the women being celebrated in stories would likely have found those stories deeply uncomfortable. They didn't need legends, they needed safety, food, somewhere to sleep without listening for footsteps. By the 19th century, pirate women became characters rather than people,
Appearing in novels, plays, and later films, they were given dramatic arcs, clever one-liners, and tidy endings. The messy parts, illness, pregnancy, dependency, and fear, were quietly removed. And this matters because when we only remember the myth, we forget the conditions that made survival so difficult in the first place. Women were rare on pirate ships not because they lacked courage or ability, but because piracy itself was hostile to long-term survival. It was hostile to bodies, to stability, to anything that required care. And women, unfairly but consistently, were expected to provide care in societies that gave them very little protection in return. So when women did appear in pirate history, they were navigating not only danger but contradiction, expected to endure like men, yet punished for being women, expected to disappear, yet remembered only when they stood out. As we slowly bring this long drift to calmer waters, what remains is not a single answer, but a pattern. Women survived pirate ships through adaptability, silence, disguise, usefulness, and sheer endurance. They were rare because the system made them rare, and when they did survive, history often struggled to know what to do with them. So let the myth fade a little, let the noise soften, and sit with the quieter truth that most pirate women were not legends, they were survivors, and sometimes being forgotten was the safest ending they could hope for. Now, just breathe. Let the ship slow. The sea is calmer here, and history, for once, doesn't need to shout to be heard.
All right, let's keep drifting. The ship is slower now. The waves aren't dramatic anymore. We've left the chaos of open piracy behind, and we're moving into something quieter, and in many ways, heavier. Because surviving the pirate ship was only half the story. What came after was often just as difficult, just less visible. When a woman left a pirate ship, whether by choice, capture, abandonment, or sheer exhaustion, she didn't step back into a normal life waiting patiently for her. Ports were suspicious places. Authorities were alert. Communities had long memories, and gossip traveled faster than ships ever did. A woman associated with pirates carried a shadow that didn't fade easily. If she arrived alone, without a man to vouch for her, questions followed immediately. Who are you? Where did you come from? Why are you here? And the most dangerous question of all, what were you doing on that ship? Honesty was rarely the safest answer. Many women learned very quickly that survival on land required a different kind of disguise. Not clothes this time, but stories. A dead husband, a lost voyage, kidnapping by pirates followed by miraculous escape. These explanations were common, believable, and hard to disprove. And they shifted blame away from the woman herself, which mattered in societies eager to judge. Because a woman who admitted to willingly sailing with pirates risked serious consequences. She could be arrested as an accomplice, she could be detained indefinitely, or more commonly, she could be socially ruined. Respectability was fragile, and piracy shattered it instantly. Even women who had been captives faced suspicion. Authorities did not always differentiate between victim and participant. Courts were inconsistent. Some women were released with apologies, others were interrogated harshly. A few were imprisoned simply because no one knew what else to do with them. And then there were the women no one bothered to question at all. Dropped at ports with no money, no documents, and no support, expected to vanish quietly into the background, which many did. Some found work in port economies, taverns, lodging houses, laundry, informal trade. These were places where stories weren't questioned too closely, and survival mattered more than reputation. Port cities were full of people who had lived strange lives and preferred not to discuss them. Others married quickly. Marriage was protection. A husband provided legitimacy, a new identity, and a reason not to ask uncomfortable questions. Many former pirate women disappeared into marriages that erased their pasts entirely. New names, new locations, new silence. And silence, more than anything, was the real survival strategy. Very few women who lived through piracy wrote about it. Literacy rates were low, and publishing your memories of criminal life was not exactly encouraged.
Those who did speak often did so indirectly through court testimony or third-party accounts, their voices filtered, summarized, and softened by others. Which is why history feels oddly empty here. We know piracy was widespread, we know women were present, but the details thin out quickly once the ships dock for the last time. Lives dissolve into fragments, a record here, a mention there, then nothing. And that nothing is telling, because it suggests that for most women, the goal after piracy was not to be remembered, it was to blend in so thoroughly that no one ever asked again. The irony, of course, is that later centuries did the opposite. They dug these women back up, reshaped them, and turned them into symbols. By the 18th and 19th centuries, piracy was already becoming nostalgic, safely distant, romantic enough to rewrite, and women became essential to that rewrite. They were used to soften piracy's image, to make it more dramatic, more rebellious, more marketable. Pirate women became characters who chose the sea for freedom, who rejected society boldly, who fought not because they had to, but because they wanted to. These stories say more about the eras that created them than about the women themselves. Real pirate women did not reject society. Society often rejected them first. Poverty, displacement, war, widowhood, these forces pushed women toward pirate ships long before rebellion ever did. And once aboard, their choices narrowed even further. Survival replaced ideology. Adaptation replaced freedom. Even Anne Bonny, so often portrayed as a symbol of defiance, spent much of her life constrained by men's decisions. Her disappearance from records is not a triumphant mystery. It is likely a quiet reintegration into a life that required forgetting. Mary Read, who lived most of her life disguised as a man, didn't do so to make a statement. She did it because male clothing unlocked safety, employment, and autonomy that women were denied. Her story isn't about piracy, it's about gender survival in an inflexible world. And this is where the story gently widens. Because pirate ships weren't unique, they were extreme examples of a broader pattern. Across history, women have survived hostile environments by adapting quietly, by becoming useful, by disappearing when necessary, and by leaving very little evidence. Piracy just makes this more visible because the setting is so stark. A wooden ship, the open sea, no law, no privacy, no safety net. And still, women endured it. They endured hunger, illness, fear, constant negotiation. They learned when to speak and when to stay invisible. They learned how power worked in small, unstable systems. They learned that survival was rarely fair and never guaranteed. Which is why the question, how did women survive on pirate ships, doesn't have a single dramatic answer. There was no secret method, no universal strategy. Survival depended on luck, timing, the temperament of the crew, and the willingness to adapt without hesitation. And the reason women were rare isn't because they didn't belong there. It's because piracy itself was an environment that discouraged anyone who couldn't absorb endless risk without breaking. And women, already carrying social disadvantages, were hit hardest. So when we imagine pirate women today, standing confidently on deck, wind in their hair, perfectly in control, it's worth remembering how carefully edited that image is. The real picture was quieter, tired, watchful. It was women sleeping lightly, listening, calculating, waiting for the next decision that might determine whether they survived another week. And when the sea finally released them, survival meant becoming ordinary again, forgettable, unremarkable. Which may not sound heroic, but in a world that wanted to consume them, erase them, or punish them for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, ordinariness was victory. So let the ship fade now. Let the wood dissolve. Let the voices soften into the background. What remains isn't a legend. It's a long, steady act of endurance. And that's enough. Just stay here for a moment. The water is calm. The story doesn't need to go anywhere else.
All right. Stay right here. Same slow rhythm, same gentle drift. By now, the ship itself has almost disappeared, but the people haven't. And this part of the story is about the people history didn't bother to keep track of, which, honestly, is most of them. Because for every Anne Bonny or Mary Read, There were dozens, probably hundreds, of women whose names were never written down. Not because they didn't matter, but because history has always been selective about who it considers worth remembering. And pirate history is especially careless. Most women connected to pirate ships appear in records only indirectly. A court document that mentions a woman present, a naval report that lists one female among captured persons, a parish record that suddenly notes a woman arriving with no background and no family. These fragments are all we get. No motivations, no emotions, just presence. And presence alone was often enough to be dangerous. If a pirate ship was captured, everyone aboard became part of the same problem. The law did not always care who had been forced, who had fought, who had cooked, or who had hidden quietly below deck. Guilt was assumed collectively. Sorting it out was inconvenient, and courts were rarely motivated by nuance. Some women were questioned and released. Others were detained for months while authorities tried to decide what category they belonged to: victim, criminal, witness, or simply nuisance. There was no standardized process. Outcomes depended on location, officials, and sometimes nothing more than mood. And then there were the women who avoided capture entirely by never being noticed in the first place. These were women who left pirate ships before things collapsed, put ashore quietly, handed a small amount of money if they were lucky, or nothing at all. They walked away carrying only what they could explain, which meant leaving most of their past behind. It's likely that many of these women returned to places that already knew hardship: coastal villages, port towns, communities shaped by trade, war, and loss. In these places, strange stories were not unusual, and survival often mattered more than truth. A woman could say she'd been widowed, or displaced, or traveling. No one demanded paperwork from people who looked like they'd already lost enough. And so pirate women dissolved back into ordinary life. Some remarried. Some took work wherever it was offered. Some never stayed anywhere long enough to be known. Their years at sea became something they didn't talk about, even to their children, especially to their children. This kind of silence wasn't shame in the modern sense. It was protection. Talking about piracy invited questions. Questions invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited trouble. And most women had learned very thoroughly that trouble was not something to court. What's striking is how little curiosity there was at the time about these women's experiences. Male pirates were interrogated extensively, their crimes recorded, their personalities described, their executions documented in detail. Women, by contrast, were often treated as side notes. Their stories weren't considered important enough to preserve, which creates a distorted picture later on. Because when later historians tried to understand women in piracy, they were forced to work with almost nothing. A few famous cases, a scattering of mentions, a lot of silence. And silence is uncomfortable. It invites invention. So the gaps were filled. Victorian writers in particular loved the idea of the pirate woman. She was exotic, transgressive, safely distant. She could be thrilling without threatening contemporary social norms because she belonged to the past. Her danger was contained. And so she became exaggerated, sexualized, simplified. Either a fearless warrior or a tragic romantic figure, sometimes both. Rarely a tired, practical survivor who just wanted the ground to stop moving. But the real women were closer to the latter. They worried about food, about illness, about being left behind, about being blamed, about what story they would tell next. They lived with constant uncertainty, and when that uncertainty finally ended, they didn't look back for meaning. They looked forward for stability. Another thing the myth erases is how interconnected piracy was with everyday maritime life. Pirates didn't exist in isolation. They came from the same communities as sailors, fishermen, dock workers, traders. Women connected to pirates already lived near the sea. They understood ships. They understood risk. They understood that men left and didn't always come back. Which means that when women ended up on pirate ships, it wasn't always as shocking as later stories suggest. In some communities, piracy was just one extreme version of a familiar world. Dangerous, illegal, but not incomprehensible.
This doesn't make it less brutal, but it does make it less romantic. And it also explains why some women navigated pirate spaces more effectively than we might expect. They already knew how power worked at sea. They already knew how fragile protection could be. They already knew how to read men who believed they were untouchable. Those skills weren't celebrated, they were just used. As piracy declined, the opportunities for women to survive within it vanished as well. Naval patrols increased, ports became stricter, ships became easier to track, and pirate crews under pressure grew more volatile. Tolerance shrank, risks multiplied. Women were often the first to be pushed out, not because they were weaker, but because they were easier to remove, easier to abandon, easier to leave behind when things went wrong. And so the era closed not with a dramatic ending, but with attrition. Fewer ships, fewer crews, fewer women, until piracy became something people talked about instead of lived through. What remains now are questions. How many women survived piracy and were never recorded? How many died without names? How many lived long, quiet lives afterward the history will never touch? We don't know, and we probably never will. But we can know this. Women were rare on pirate ships because piracy was not built for them, or for anyone who needed protection, stability, or care. Those who survived did so by becoming adaptable, cautious, and often invisible. They didn't conquer the sea, they endured it. And endurance doesn't leave monuments. So if this story feels unfinished, that's appropriate. Most real lives are, especially the ones lived at the margins of legality, power, and memory. We're left with fragments, and spaces between fragments, and a quiet understanding that history is full of people who did extraordinary things simply to stay alive, and then went on to do something even harder. They disappeared. So just rest here for a moment. Let the sea flatten out completely. The ship is gone now. What's left is the quiet after survival, where nothing dramatic happens, and that's exactly the point.
All right, let's settle in. The sea is calm now. No cannon fire, no shouting, no sudden planks collapsing underfoot. The ships are gone. The pirates have vanished, scattered by law, time, and their own poor decision-making. But the women who survived, those who somehow navigated the chaos, the superstition, the danger, and the endless grinding boredom, left a shadow that lingers in history, if you look carefully. And the story of that shadow is what we're drifting into now. After leaving the ships, after stepping down from the rocking decks and the salt-scorched sails, women faced a world that had not changed for them, even though they had changed for themselves. Survival had made them sharper, more cautious, more capable in ways few other people could recognize. But the societies waiting at the ports, the towns, the cities, were often indifferent at best, hostile at worst. Being a woman who had spent time among pirates was, in the eyes of most people on land, a mark of suspicion. The sea had made them durable, yes, but it had also made them visible, and visibility could be dangerous. A woman who had fought, or sewn sails, or disguised herself as a man, or hidden quietly below deck, or nursed the wounded, now had to translate that experience into a form that was understandable, acceptable, and safe for the land-based world. And there was no easy translation. Combat skills were useless unless you wanted to scare everyone around you, and no one wanted to hire a skilled fighter who had spent years in lawless environments. Sewing and cooking could help, but only if someone believed your story enough to give you a steady position. Even knowledge of navigation, medicine, or ship maintenance, the very things that kept you alive at sea, was often considered suspect or irrelevant in polite society. Some women reinvented themselves quietly. They took new names. They married quickly. Marriage in those times was not necessarily a romantic choice. It was protection, identity, stability, and a shield against inquiry. A husband could provide legitimacy, a place to live, a reason to be seen without interrogation. And for many women,
This was the only real form of safety they could access after years at sea. They were pragmatic, they adapted, they survived. And survival, in a society that would have questioned, punished, or ignored them otherwise, was itself an achievement. But survival often required forgetting. The women who returned to land frequently erased the sea from their personal histories. They didn't tell children about what they had endured. They didn't boast about adventures, even when friends pressed. They learned silence as a skill. Silence could protect you from suspicion, from judgment, from being dragged into court, or from drawing the attention of people who were less forgiving than pirates ever were. And in this silence, a paradox arises. While pirate women were often central figures on their ships, on land, they had to disappear to remain safe. They had to render themselves ordinary to survive. This is part of why history is so thin on their lives. Records, when they exist, are fragmentary. A court deposition here, a parish entry there, occasional mentions in the diaries of men who wrote about the raid or the capture or the trial. But the lives of women themselves, their thoughts, fears, and small triumphs, are mostly invisible. The fragments we have are sometimes tantalizing, but they are never complete. And the silence, as historians know, tells us something crucial. It is itself evidence. Women survived not only by their actions, but by controlling what others could see of them, by leaving the right things hidden, and by making themselves unremarkable when necessary. Even those who became legendary, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, only appear in the historical record because of extraordinary circumstances, and even then, the details are messy, contradictory, and sparse. Anne Bonny disappears entirely after her imprisonment. Mary Read dies young, barely recorded beyond the legal documents. The vast majority of pirate women never even appear in court. They simply vanished, quietly returning to life on land. And if we imagine them as heroic rebels, constantly swashbuckling and firing pistols, we're projecting fantasies onto people whose real lives were far more complicated, often boring, and almost always defined by survival rather than romance or drama. Another aspect worth noting is age. Pirate mythology tends to cast women as young, daring, and hyper-capable. In reality, women on ships came in all ages. Some were older, some were mothers, some had already experienced hardship before they ever set foot aboard a pirate vessel. Poverty, widowhood, displacement, and social marginalization pushed many into piracy-adjacent spaces. These were not adventures chosen lightly. They were choices constrained by circumstance, and the sea demanded adaptability, resilience, and quick thinking. Youth and beauty mattered less than the ability to endure discomfort and risk. Let's also consider the mundane horrors that shaped these lives, which no romanticized story ever touches. There was constant filth, lack of privacy, crowding, disease, starvation, rats, and lice, the smell of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and stagnant water, weather extremes that made decks slippery and sails impossible to repair, injuries that were treated with alcohol and blunt instruments, and for women, the added complications of pregnancy, menstruation, and social vulnerability. The freedom of piracy was always limited by the basic requirements of human survival, which for women were made exponentially harder by biology and social prejudice. Even relationships with men were complicated. Some women became companions to captains or officers, not out of choice necessarily, but because it offered protection. Others relied on male allies among the crew, but these relationships were unstable. Pirates were notoriously unreliable. A captain could be killed, captured, or replaced in a moment, instantly removing the protection that a woman had counted on. Dependence, even strategic dependence, was precarious at best. Women had to constantly calculate risk, read moods, and anticipate danger, not just from the outside world, but from the men surrounding them. And yet, despite all of this, women survived. Some survived months, some survived years. Some survived enough to return to land, make new lives, and leave the pirate world forever. Others didn't survive at all, their lives lost to storms, disease, violence, or misfortune.
And for those who did survive, the stories we tell are always filtered through myth, legend, and later interpretation. The sea claimed them quietly, invisibly, and then history claimed the rest. Which brings us back to the broader truth. Women on pirate ships were rare not because they were incapable, not because they lacked courage, but because the environment was designed to be hostile. Piracy in reality was not glamorous. It was exhausting, it was dangerous, it was unpredictable, and it offered very little margin for error. Survival depended on adaptability, cunning, and sometimes sheer luck. And when the environment no longer required them, women had to disappear, erase themselves, and blend into the ordinary world to survive again. The story of pirate women, then, is a story of endurance. It's quiet, it's uncomfortable, it's not full of the dramatic standoffs or witty comebacks that later writers will invent, but it's extraordinary in its own way. Because surviving at sea, surviving under constant threat, and surviving on land afterwards requires a kind of resilience that history rarely recognizes. And for those women, disappearing into silence was not failure, it was triumph. So, let the ship drift out of view completely. Let the waves flatten. Let the wind carry away the creaking of timbers and the distant shouting of men. What remains is the quiet legacy of countless unnamed, unrecorded women who navigated danger with subtlety, endurance, and intelligence. They survived when survival seemed impossible, and they did it mostly unseen. And in the long calm after piracy, that quiet survival is in itself remarkable.
All right, let's continue drifting, slowly, gently. The pirate ships are gone, the waves have flattened, but the echo of their journeys lingers. The women who survived, who endured months or years in cramped, chaotic, dangerous spaces, now faced a world that neither recognized their resilience nor understood the quiet strategies that had kept them alive. And this is where survival transformed into something far more subtle, far more intricate: adaptation on land. Returning from the sea was rarely a triumphant homecoming. Ports were suspicious, towns were alert, and authorities often assumed guilt by association. A woman stepping off a ship that had been pursued by navies or raided by authorities was immediately under scrutiny. Who had she been with? What had she done? Why was she here? Questions, accusations, and judgment followed closely behind her every move. In many cases, discretion was the only real form of protection. Speaking too much or too freely about her time at sea could be dangerous, and so silence became both shield and strategy. Many women reinvented themselves quietly, crafting stories that could explain their presence without inviting suspicion. Widowhood, shipwreck, kidnapping, trade gone wrong, these were common explanations, easily understood and rarely challenged. A woman might claim she had escaped capture, or that her husband had disappeared at sea, or that she had merely traveled for work. These narratives allowed her to step back into society without revealing her survival on pirate ships, which was often the only safe option. Marriage became a particularly practical solution. It provided legitimacy, protection, and social camouflage. A husband offered a name, a home, and a reason for a woman to be seen without interrogation or suspicion. Some women married men who knew their past, but more often than not, marriage erased it completely. New identities, new communities, and new roles replaced the dangerous, lawless life of the ship. And in these quiet, domestic spaces, survival continued, but invisibly. The skills learned at sea, the ability to read danger, the capacity for patience and endurance, all remained, subtly shaping daily life, even if the broader world never acknowledged them. Work in port cities also provided a path forward. Taverns, inns,
boarding houses, laundries, markets. These spaces allowed women to survive economically without demanding explanation. Practical skills like sewing, cooking, or knowledge of trade could be applied safely. Yet even here, they had to balance visibility with discretion. Drawing attention could attract the wrong type of curiosity, especially from authorities eager to punish or from communities eager to gossip. Life became a careful negotiation between capability, discretion, and quiet endurance. And for many, the psychological labor of adjusting to land life was enormous. The rhythm of the sea, unpredictable, dangerous, exhausting, was replaced by the slow, methodical pressure of social rules, propriety, and survival in a world that had never fully welcomed them. The skills learned at sea, the ability to read danger, the capacity for patience and endurance, all remained, subtly shaping daily life, even if the broader world never acknowledged them. Yet the myth of pirate women did not reflect this reality. Literature, theater, and later films painted a romantic, adventurous picture. Anne Bonny and Mary Read became icons of rebellion, freedom, and fearless action. The hardships, the exhaustion, the fear, the constant negotiation, and the invisibility that defined real pirate survival were replaced by spectacle and glamour. And in doing so, the stories of countless unnamed women were further erased. Their survival, subtle and quiet, became invisible, overshadowed by legends created by men centuries later. Even the women who were named had their experiences flattened into tidy narratives. Danger became excitement, fear became thrill, adaptation became rebellion. And while these narratives are compelling, they rarely capture the true endurance, intelligence, and subtlety required to navigate piracy and return to land alive. The reality is far less glamorous, but far more extraordinary. Living through constant risk, negotiating unstable power structures, maintaining invisibility when necessary, and ultimately returning to land and surviving again, this is the quiet heroism that history seldom acknowledges. Some women remarried, some took employment, some faded entirely into anonymity. Some may have returned to the sea in quieter, less visible roles, trading, fishing, traveling along the coast. But all of them carried the imprint of piracy in ways that could not be erased. The sharpness of observation, the ability to endure prolonged stress, the understanding of human behavior under extreme conditions. These were skills born of necessity and survival rather than adventure or thrill. And here we reach another truth. Pirate women were rare not because they lacked courage or ability, but because the environment they entered was designed to punish anyone who could not absorb endless risk without breaking. The ships, the crews, the storms, the constant threat of capture, all of these created an ecosystem that filtered for endurance, adaptability, and discretion. And women, already constrained by social and biological pressures, were disproportionately challenged. Those who survived had to navigate both the literal dangers of the sea and the social dangers of being female in a world that had never fully welcomed them. So when we imagine pirate women today, standing boldly on deck, pistols raised, hair blowing in the wind, it's important to remember that the reality was far more subtle, far quieter, and far more extraordinary in its own understated way. They survived because they adapted, because they observed, because they understood the fragile systems around them. They survived because sometimes they disappeared entirely when attention threatened them. They survived because endurance, not glory, was the goal. And in this quiet endurance lies a kind of heroism rarely celebrated. It is invisible, largely unrecorded, and almost entirely forgotten. Yet it shapes the way we understand survival in extreme conditions, the way we understand human resilience, and the way we consider the stories that history chooses to preserve or ignore. The sea no longer claims these women, but their lessons remain. Endurance, discretion, and adaptability are forms of strength as vital as any sword or pistol. So, breathe. Let the waves flatten completely. Let the wind vanish. Let the ship drift into memory. And remember the women who survived, who disappeared, who endured quietly, and who left a shadow on history that is faint but persistent. Their lives were not glamorous. They were not legends in their own time, but the quiet, steadfast survival they achieved is, in its own way, remarkable.
All right, let's settle into the final stretch. Slow, steady, and unhurried. The ships have disappeared. The sea is calm, almost unnervingly quiet, as if it too is paying homage to the women who once navigated its chaos. And now we turn to what came afterward, not immediately after leaving the ships, but in the decades that followed, when the world had forgotten the chaos of piracy, yet the echoes of those lives persisted in ways subtle, quiet, and almost invisible. This is where the story of pirate women broadens into history itself, revealing patterns, lessons, and truths that survive even when individual names do not. Once women stepped back onto land, they entered societies that neither understood nor particularly valued the skills they had acquired. Navigation, combat, medical care, seamanship, resourcefulness. These abilities were extraordinary at sea, but in port towns, villages, or cities, they were often invisible or irrelevant. Social norms, economic restrictions, and gendered expectations created a landscape in which survival depended not on daring, but on discretion, adaptation, and the ability to blend seamlessly into ordinary life. In effect, the very abilities that had ensured their survival on pirate ships were often incompatible with survival on land without modification, camouflage, or careful storytelling. Many women reinvented themselves quietly, creating plausible narratives that shielded them from scrutiny. Widowhood, shipwreck, travel for work or displacement were common explanations that allowed them to disappear back into society. Marriage became an especially practical strategy. It offered a legitimate identity, protection, and the social recognition needed to deflect suspicion. In some cases, women married men who were aware of their past. In most cases, the past was erased, quietly buried beneath domestic routines, economic necessity, and the performance of respectability. Survival continued invisibly in kitchens, homes, laundries, and markets, while the legacy of the sea shaped their judgment, patience, and capacity for endurance. Work in urban or port economies often allowed women to leverage practical skills gained at sea. Sewing sails had become sewing clothes. Cooking for a crew became cooking for a tavern or boarding house. Knowledge of medicine or herbal remedies became tending to the sick or injured in towns where hospitals were scarce. These skills were useful, but subtly dangerous. Drawing attention could provoke questions that were best avoided, and visibility was often a liability. Women had to carefully negotiate presence and discretion, balancing livelihood with invisibility, always aware that the past they carried could suddenly become a source of danger if discovered by authorities, neighbors, or opportunists. Psychological adaptation was as crucial as practical survival. The relentless rhythm of the sea, the storms, the exhaustion, the danger, and the constant need for vigilance was replaced by the subtle pressures of social expectations. Politeness, discretion, conformity, and endurance under silent scrutiny became daily tools. Women had to navigate communities that judged them instantly, interpret social cues with precision, and understand the unspoken hierarchies that dictated who could ask questions and who could not. Many had developed acute perception aboard ships. Now they applied it on land in even more subtle ways.
The ability to anticipate danger, read intentions, and remain unnoticed became the key to a quiet, ongoing survival that often went unrecorded. The myth of pirate women, which developed increasingly in literature, theater, and later films, rarely reflects this reality. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, though extraordinary in their own right, were elevated to almost symbolic status, their lives filtered through layers of romanticized narrative. Daring, rebellious, and glamorous, these portrayals omitted the fear, exhaustion, and constant vigilance that defined real survival. Countless unnamed women, whose endurance had been no less impressive, faded from records entirely. Their quiet strategies, their ability to adapt, and their resilience were erased in favor of spectacle, leaving an incomplete and often misleading impression of the lived realities aboard pirate ships. Even named figures are often misunderstood. Their appearances in records are fragmentary, legal documents, trial accounts, or brief mentions in other people's narratives. These women were not celebrated in their time. They were noted because extraordinary circumstances forced recognition. Most of the women who survived vanished into anonymity. They married, worked, moved, or simply remained silent, their experiences disappearing into the ordinary flow of daily life. The lessons they carried, however, persisted, even if unseen: patience, observation, discretion, endurance, and strategic adaptability. Age, social background, and circumstance shaped experiences significantly. Pirate mythology emphasizes youth and daring, but real women aboard ships ranged widely in age and experience. Some were older, some had endured hardship prior to joining ships, and some were pushed into maritime spaces by poverty, widowhood, or displacement. Choices were rarely voluntary in a modern sense. They were constrained by necessity, survival, and circumstance. Adaptability rather than rebellion defined these women's lives, and the ability to read complex human dynamics, navigate danger, and disappear when required often determined whether they lived or died. The mundane realities of life at sea must also be acknowledged. Crowded, unsanitary conditions, disease, rats, lice, and vermin, spoiled food, limited privacy, extreme weather, constant labor, injury treated crudely, lack of rest, and vulnerability due to social and biological constraints created an environment that was relentless and unforgiving. Women had to navigate these realities while simultaneously negotiating power, protection, and perception among crews, captains, and officers. Pregnancy, menstruation, and the need for personal safety added additional layers of complexity and risk, underscoring that survival was an act of continuous calculation, endurance, and resilience. Relationships aboard ships were rarely simple. Attachments to captains or officers could provide protection, better rations, and temporary safety, but these alliances were fragile. Captains could die, be captured, or lose favor. Dependence on male allies could shift from protection to peril in moments. Women had to read moods, predict outcomes, and adapt quickly to the shifting currents of hierarchy and threat. Many who survived did so by cultivating subtle influence, performing utility, or remaining unobtrusive, rather than through direct confrontation or combat. And yet, for all this adaptation, women who survived often returned to a society unprepared to acknowledge their skills. Survival at sea, while remarkable, was largely invisible in traditional social hierarchies. Their capacity for endurance, intelligence, and practical problem-solving was seldom rewarded or recognized. They returned not as legends, but as quiet survivors, blending into domestic, commercial, or communal spaces. Adaptation continued, now expressed in compliance, camouflage, and the management of social perception rather than direct action. Over time, the mythos of pirate women grew louder than reality. Historical erasure, literary embellishment, and cultural fascination transformed them into symbols of rebellion, independence, and daring adventure. These stories are compelling, but they obscure the subtler heroism of the majority: endurance without recognition, survival without fame, quiet strategy without applause. The women who navigated pirate ships and returned to land carried skills, experience, and insight that shaped their lives in invisible but profound ways. Their resilience is the real legacy, though rarely celebrated, of the pirate era. Ultimately, the lives of pirate women teach us about the intersection of gender, survival, and historical memory. They reveal how extraordinary endurance can be made invisible, how adaptation can outlast recognition, and how survival itself can constitute a form of quiet heroism. The sea no longer claims them, and the ships have rotted into legend. But the lessons of observation, discretion, endurance, and adaptability persist. And in their shadows, we can glimpse the lives of countless women who survived what history almost forgot. So let the sea flatten completely, the wind die down, and the creaking wood dissolve into memory. There is no final triumph, no dramatic applause. There is only the quiet continuation of life, the faint shadow of survival, and the enduring impression of women who navigated chaos with subtlety, intelligence, and resilience. Their stories, fragmentary and incomplete, remind us that survival itself is extraordinary, even when the world never remembers who endured it. And in that quiet, unassuming endurance, we find a truth that outlasts cannon fire, legend, and myth. Surviving the impossible, unseen and uncelebrated, can be its own kind of greatness.
All right, let's drift once more, slowly, letting the memory of the ships fade further into mist, but not the experiences of the women who once navigated them. Because what comes after survival is often quieter, subtler, and yet perhaps even more remarkable. The women who returned from pirate ships didn't just resume ordinary life. They carried with them lessons of endurance, adaptability, and subtle negotiation that the world around them neither recognized nor valued. And in exploring this, we begin to understand the quiet legacy of pirate women, a legacy not of cannon fire or heroic duels, but of careful calculation, resilience, and survival against relentless odds. Returning to land after years at sea was not a triumphant moment for most women. There was no welcoming party, no medals of valor, no safe harbor where someone would understand the complexities of what they had endured. Instead, there were suspicious authorities, curious neighbors, and a society eager to define and contain women according to its own rigid expectations. Being known as a woman who had been aboard a pirate ship was simultaneously dangerous and meaningless. Dangerous because it implied association with crime, lawlessness, and immorality, and meaningless because the skills and experiences that had ensured survival at sea were not acknowledged as valuable in everyday life. To survive once more, women had to adapt, yet again, to an environment that neither understood them nor appreciated them. For many, survival on land required carefully constructed stories. Widowhood, shipwreck, trade gone wrong, forced displacement. These narratives allowed women to explain their presence without inviting suspicion. And these narratives had to be consistent, believable, and carefully performed. Any discrepancy could draw unwanted attention, whether from authorities, neighbors, or opportunists. Silence and discretion became the most effective tools, even more so than courage or cunning had been at sea. Where once a woman might have survived by sewing sails, hiding below deck, or earning a captain's protection, now she survived by blending in, performing social proprieties, and erasing her past from the eyes of those around her. Marriage became one of the most effective forms of camouflage. A husband provided legitimacy, a home, and a socially accepted identity. For many women, this was less about romance than about safety, survival, and the ability to move through the world without constant scrutiny. In some cases, women married men who knew fragments of their past. In most cases, the past was quietly buried beneath domestic routines, work, and community obligations. The ordinary rhythm of life, household chores, child rearing, small trades, offered stability even if it demanded the erasure of extraordinary experiences. In this way, survival at sea was transformed into survival on land, a quieter, subtler kind of endurance that history rarely records or celebrates.
Work provided another avenue for reintegration. Women applied skills learned at sea, sewing, cooking, basic medical knowledge, and practical problem solving to new contexts. Taverns, boarding houses, laundries, markets, these were spaces where women could earn a living without drawing dangerous attention. Yet even here, visibility was double-edged. Being too competent, too noticeable, or too assertive could provoke suspicion or hostility. Adaptation required not only skill, but careful social intelligence, the ability to navigate nuanced human interactions, and the constant calculation of risk versus reward. The same perceptiveness that had kept the woman alive aboard a pirate ship now ensured her survival in urban or coastal society. Psychological endurance remained crucial. The ceaseless vigilance required at sea, watching moods, anticipating conflict, reading threats, translated into a quiet hyper-awareness on land. Social situations, courtly expectations, and community norms demanded constant attention. Every conversation, every interaction had to be navigated with care. A misplaced word, a hint of impropriety, or even accidental revelation could jeopardize a hard-won stability. Adaptation meant mastering invisibility, controlling narratives, and ensuring that no one could infer the dangerous experiences that had shaped them. Meanwhile, cultural memory of pirate women diverged sharply from reality. The few names who survived, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, became icons of rebellion and daring. Their stories were retold in literature, theater, and eventually film, often glorifying the adventure while erasing fear, exhaustion, and the constant calculations of survival. These figures became symbols rather than reflections of lived experience. The thousands of women who survived yet remained unnamed are almost entirely absent from history. Their quiet heroism, adapting, surviving, blending, enduring, remains invisible. Yet it is no less remarkable than the tales that became legendary. Age, circumstance, and social background further shaped survival. Pirate mythology often imagines young, glamorous women defying men effortlessly. In reality, women aboard ships ranged widely in age and experience. Some were older, some had endured hardship long before the sea, some were mothers, and many had been forced into maritime spaces by poverty, displacement, or widowhood. Their choices were rarely voluntary in a modern sense. They were constrained by necessity and circumstance. Adaptation, subtlety, and endurance rather than heroics determined survival. Life at sea was relentless. Crowding, filth, disease, vermin, spoiled food, harsh weather, and constant labor made everyday existence a struggle. Injuries were treated crudely. Privacy was non-existent. Women had to navigate these physical challenges while also negotiating social hierarchies, power dynamics, and male temperaments. Pregnancy and biological vulnerability added additional layers of complexity. Survival required continuous vigilance, resilience, and careful attention to social and environmental cues. Relationships on ships were never simple. Some women became companions to captains or officers, gaining temporary protection and resources. Others relied on male allies among the crew. These relationships were fragile. Captains could die, be captured, or lose influence at any moment. Dependence could shift from protection to danger in seconds. Women had to anticipate outcomes, read behaviors, and act quickly. Subtlety, intelligence, and adaptability were more important than brute strength or combat skill. Returning to land, women faced a society that largely ignored these skills. Survival at sea was extraordinary, but irrelevant in the social hierarchies awaiting them. Their ability to endure, observe, and adapt often went unrecognized. They returned as quiet survivors, blending into domestic, commercial, or communal spaces. Adaptation continued in new forms: compliance, camouflage, social navigation, but always with the same goal: survival. Over time, the myth of pirate women eclipsed the reality. Literature, theater, and later film portrayed them as fearless adventurers. Danger became excitement, fear became thrill, endurance became rebellion. And while these stories are compelling, they obscure the quiet heroism of the majority. living through unrelenting stress, navigating complex social dynamics, and surviving invisible to history. Their endurance, strategic invisibility, and subtle intelligence are the true legacy of pirate women. In conclusion, pirate women were rare not because of lack of courage, but because the environment they entered was hostile to survival. Ships, crews, storms, disease, and social constraints filtered for endurance, intelligence, and adaptability. Women bore additional burdens, yet many survived, often unseen. Their lives challenge the popular myths and remind us that heroism is sometimes quiet, invisible, and ordinary in appearance, even when extraordinary in substance. Let the ship dissolve into memory. Let the waves flatten. And in that calm, recognize the women who endured chaos, risk, and constant uncertainty. They survived not for fame, not for legend, but because survival itself was a form of greatness. Their legacy is subtle, persistent, and enduring, an echo that history may rarely record, but remains unmistakably real.
All right, let's settle in for the final drift of this long, slow journey. The pirate ships are gone. The sea has calmed. The creaking of timbers, the shouting of crews, and the constant threat of capture have faded into memory. And yet, the echoes of those lives, the women who endured, adapted, and survived, remain, rippling across time in ways subtle, invisible, but profoundly significant. This is the part of the story that moves beyond immediate survival, beyond the myth, beyond the legends of Anne Bonny or Mary Read, to consider the long-lasting impact of these women's lives and the lessons their endurance teaches us. When women returned from pirate ships, they did not re-enter ordinary life unchanged. The sea had shaped them in ways that land could not undo. Survival had taught them observation, calculation, endurance, patience, and the ability to navigate complex social hierarchies, all skills vital for life on land, but often invisible, unacknowledged, or misunderstood by the societies they returned to. Port towns, villages, and cities were not built to recognize such capabilities. Instead, they demanded conformity, discretion, and compliance. A woman who had survived the chaos of piracy now faced the subtler chaos of social expectation, and she adapted once more, quietly, strategically, and without fanfare. Discretion became survival on land. Many women fabricated plausible narratives to explain their presence and deflect suspicion. Widowhood, misfortune at sea, forced travel, or displacement were common explanations. These narratives allowed them to blend into ordinary society, often erasing the memory of the pirate ship entirely. Marriage was another critical strategy, a socially recognized identity, protection, legitimacy, and the ability to exist without continuous interrogation. In most cases, the past was not revealed, it was buried beneath domestic duties, economic activity, and social obligations. Survival, in its quietest form, required not heroics, but invisibility. Work provided a second path. Skills learned at sea, sewing, cooking, basic medical knowledge, and practical problem-solving found new application in urban and port economies. Taverns, boarding houses, laundries, markets, and trades offered employment, yet visibility could be risky. Being too competent or noticeable might provoke suspicion, or worse, draw unwanted attention from authorities. Social intelligence became just as vital as practical skill, knowing when to speak, when to remain silent, how to navigate conversations, and how to appear ordinary while carrying extraordinary experiences within. The subtleties of adaptation on land were in many ways as demanding as survival at sea. Psychological endurance remained a constant requirement. The ceaseless vigilance of pirate life, watching moods, anticipating conflict, predicting outcomes, translated into everyday social navigation. Communities were judgmental, gossip traveled quickly, and any misstep could jeopardize stability. Women applied skills honed in extreme maritime environments to domestic, professional, and communal life, often invisibly, using perception,
caution, and intelligence to maintain equilibrium. Adaptation had become second nature. Survival, once again, depended not on strength or courage alone, but on subtle, careful negotiation of human behavior. Meanwhile, the myth of pirate women grew louder than reality. In literature, theater, and later films, Anne Bonny and Mary Read were elevated into symbols of rebellion, adventure, and glamour. Their stories were retold with danger transformed into excitement, fear into thrill, endurance into spectacle. Countless unnamed women whose survival was no less extraordinary vanished from record entirely. Their heroism, quiet, adaptive, invisible, was largely ignored. What survived was legend, often misleading, obscuring the subtle genius of ordinary survival that had characterized the majority of women aboard pirate ships. Age, social background, and prior experience mattered. Pirate mythology favors young, glamorous women, but real women varied widely. Some were older, some had endured hardship long before ever setting foot on a ship, some were mothers or widows. Many were driven by poverty, displacement, or societal pressure rather than choice or thrill. Their lives demonstrate that survival is rarely glamorous. It is calculated, persistent, and often invisible. Endurance, intelligence, and subtlety dictated whether a woman lived or died. Life at sea was relentless. Crowding, filth, disease, vermin, spoiled food, extreme weather, and constant labor made daily existence a struggle. Injuries were crudely treated. Privacy was non-existent. Pregnancy and biological vulnerability added additional challenges. Women navigated physical, social, and psychological dangers simultaneously. Survival required unbroken attention, patience, and adaptability. The myth of daring adventure obscures these realities, presenting instead a simplified, sensationalized image that diminishes the complexity of endurance. Relationships aboard ships were complex and precarious. Protection from captains or officers could be life-saving, but also temporary. Alliances shifted with the tides of authority, luck, and temperament. Dependence could turn into danger instantly. Women had to constantly read situations, anticipate outcomes, and respond with strategy rather than force. Subtlety and intelligence were often more valuable than combat skill. The women who survived learned to balance utility, discretion, and invisibility, often avoiding danger rather than confronting it. Returning to land, the challenge was equally formidable. Societies were not structured to reward endurance or intelligence in women. Survival required the continuation of strategies honed at sea: discretion, adaptation, social navigation, and invisibility. Skills that had saved lives aboard ships applied in new contexts, managing households, negotiating trades, avoiding scrutiny, and blending into ordinary social frameworks. These abilities, though largely invisible, defined their success and persistence. Over time, myths obscured reality further. Literature, theater, and cinema transformed pirate women into symbols of rebellion and adventure. Daring, fearlessness, and glamour replaced endurance, subtlety, and careful adaptation. The countless unnamed women who survived, adapted, and thrived remained invisible. Their stories are fragments, shadows, whispers, but they carry profound lessons. Courage is not always visible, heroism is not always recognized, and survival itself can be a remarkable form of greatness. Ultimately, the rarity of pirate women was not due to a lack of courage or ability. It was because the environment of piracy, ships, storms, disease, violence, and social constraints, filtered for endurance, intelligence, and adaptability. Women bore additional burdens, yet many survived through strategy, discretion, and subtlety. Their survival challenges conventional narratives of heroism, revealing that endurance, adaptation, and invisibility can constitute extraordinary achievement. And as we drift to the end of this narrative, the ships dissolve completely, the waves flatten, and the echoes of pirate women linger. They endured chaos, threat, and uncertainty. They survived invisibly, strategically, and uncelebrated. Their stories are fragments, shadows, whispers, but they carry profound lessons. Courage is not always visible, heroism is not always recognized, and survival itself can be a remarkable form of greatness. Let the sea settle entirely, let the wind vanish, and let the quiet of endurance prevail. History may not remember names, but the ripples of these women's lives persist. They endured, adapted, and survived, and in their survival lies a subtle, lasting legacy that continues to teach us about resilience, intelligence, and the quiet power of living through the impossible.
All right, let's drift again, slow and steady, letting the memory of the ships fade further, but not the influence of the women who navigated them. Because survival was only part of their story. What they carried forward, skills, knowledge, adaptability, psychological endurance, flowed into the societies they returned to, often invisible, often unacknowledged, yet quietly reshaping the world around them. In exploring this, we move beyond piracy itself and into the subtle, persistent legacy these women left behind, the hidden currents that shaped communities, trades, and even maritime culture in ways that history rarely credits. Returning from pirate ships, women found themselves in a paradoxical world. They had mastered chaos, navigated danger, and survived extraordinary adversity. Yet the social landscapes they returned to were structured to ignore or constrain the very capabilities that had kept them alive. Practical skills, navigation, seamanship, medical knowledge, strategic observation, problem solving were largely undervalued for women in port towns or villages. Instead, conformity, discretion, and social compliance became paramount. Adaptation on land was a different type of survival, requiring subtlety, intelligence, and constant negotiation of human behavior. Discretion remained the foremost tool. Women crafted narratives that allowed them to re-enter society safely. Stories of widowhood, displacement, shipwreck, or forced travel were common, plausible, and protective. These narratives erased their past from public memory, yet they carried lessons and resilience gained at sea. Marriage often reinforced this camouflage. A husband provided legitimacy, a home, and social acceptance. In most cases, the past was hidden completely, buried beneath domestic routines, economic work, and community obligations. Survival demanded invisibility, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Work offered another channel for influence. The skills honed at sea, sewing, cooking, medical care, trade knowledge, practical problem solving, were applied in taverns, boarding houses, laundries, markets, and trades. Yet visibility was delicate. Being too skilled or noticeable could draw suspicion or scrutiny. Women had to balance competence with discretion, skill with social invisibility. The very abilities that had ensured survival on pirate ships were now a quiet force shaping communities, economies, and households in ways few ever recorded or acknowledged. Psychological endurance remained crucial. Vigilance, risk assessment, and social perception, skills essential aboard ships, translated directly into life on land. Communities judged quickly, gossip traveled fast, and any misstep could destabilize a hard-won existence. Women had to read subtle social cues, anticipate consequences, and maneuver through complex hierarchies invisibly. Their previous experience navigating dangerous crews and shifting alliances provided them with unparalleled insight into human behavior, which now became a quiet, invisible form of influence in local social systems. Meanwhile, myth and legend obscured reality further. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were elevated into symbols of adventure, rebellion, and glamour. Danger became entertainment, fear became thrill,
Endurance became spectacle. The thousands of unnamed women whose survival required intelligence, strategy, and discretion remained absent from historical record. Yet their influence persisted, shaping households, communities, and maritime culture in subtle ways that survived through observation, oral tradition, and practice rather than written history. Age, circumstance, and social background added further nuance. Pirate mythology often imagines young, glamorous women defying men effortlessly, but reality was different. Women aboard ships ranged widely in age, experience, and social position. Some were older. Some had endured hardship before ever boarding a ship. Some were mothers or widows. Many were driven into maritime spaces by poverty, displacement, or social marginalization. Choices were constrained by necessity. Survival depended on intelligence, adaptability, and subtlety, not bravado or spectacle. Life at sea was relentless. Crowding, filth, disease, vermin, spoiled food, exposure, and constant labor made daily existence extraordinarily difficult. Injuries were treated crudely. Privacy was non-existent. Pregnancy and biological vulnerability added layers of complexity. Women navigated these challenges while also managing social hierarchies, power dynamics, and male temperaments. Survival required vigilance, strategy, and endurance, making daily life aboard pirate ships a masterclass in practical intelligence under extreme conditions. Relationships were delicate and fraught with risk. Companionship with captains or officers could provide protection, better rations and resources, but was temporary and precarious. Male allies within the crew were unreliable. Alliances shifted quickly with changing authority, chance, or temperament. Dependence could shift to danger instantly. Women had to anticipate outcomes, read behavior, and act strategically. Subtlety and intelligence often mattered more than physical strength or combat skill. Those who survived mastered utility, discretion, and invisibility above all. Returning to land, the challenge remained. Societies were unprepared to recognize the extraordinary endurance of women who survived piracy. Skills that had saved lives at sea, observation, patience, negotiation, strategic thinking, were often invisible, undervalued, or constrained by social norms. Adaptation continued, navigating domestic, professional, and communal spaces with intelligence, discretion, and subtlety. Endurance persisted, now expressed in social management and survival rather than combat or maritime skill. Over time, myths eclipsed reality. Literature, theater, and cinema portrayed pirate women as daring adventurers, fearless rebels, and glamorous figures. The nuance, the subtle heroism, the quiet survival of thousands of unnamed women faded from collective memory. Yet their legacy of these women lived on in the skills, wisdom, and resilience they imparted within families, communities, trades, and maritime culture, in their subtle, indirect, and often invisible but persistent influence. Ultimately, the rarity of pirate women was not due to incapacity or lack of courage. It was because piracy, ships, storms, disease, violence, and social constraints filtered for endurance, intelligence, and adaptability. Women carried additional burdens, yet survived through strategy, discretion, and subtlety. Their survival challenges conventional narratives of heroism, showing that endurance, adaptability, and invisibility can be forms of remarkable achievement. As we drift to the close of this narrative, the ships dissolve completely, the waves flatten, and the echoes of pirate women linger. They endured chaos, danger, and uncertainty. They survived unseen, uncelebrated, yet profoundly influential. Their stories, though fragmentary, leave a subtle imprint on history,
a reminder that courage is not always visible, heroism not always recognized, and survival itself is a remarkable achievement. Let the sea settle, the wind vanish, and the quiet of endurance prevail. Pirate women endured, adapted, and survived. Their hidden influence persists, faint but undeniable, teaching lessons about resilience, intelligence, and the extraordinary power of quiet survival. In their shadows lies a truth rarely acknowledged. Surviving against impossible odds, unseen and uncelebrated, is itself greatness.
All right, let's drift slowly one more time, letting the sea flatten completely, the wind calm, and the chaos of pirate ships dissolve into memory. And yet, even as the ships vanish, the echoes of the women who survived aboard them persist. This is a story not just of survival, but of enduring influence, quiet legacy, and the ways in which these women, almost invisible in the historical record, shaped the worlds they returned to. Their presence, though often unrecorded, left ripples across communities, families, trades, and maritime culture, ripples that persisted long after piracy itself declined. Returning from pirate ships, women faced a paradoxical world. They had mastered danger, chaos, and uncertainty at sea, yet the societies waiting on land neither recognized nor valued the skills they had acquired. Navigation, combat knowledge, resourcefulness, strategic observation, problem-solving, and resilience were extraordinary at sea, but largely invisible or undervalued on land. Instead, conformity, social expectation, and discretion became paramount. Survival on land demanded subtle intelligence, adaptability, and the capacity to read people and situations, much like survival at sea, but in a context governed by invisible rules, gossip, and social judgment, rather than waves and storms. Discretion remained the most vital tool. Many women crafted narratives to protect themselves: widowhood, shipwreck, misfortune, or forced travel. Marriage often provided additional protection and legitimacy. A husband offered a socially recognized identity, a home, and the ability to exist without constant scrutiny. In many cases, the past was erased completely, buried beneath domestic routines, economic work, and community participation. Survival demanded invisibility, careful social navigation, and the quiet performance of ordinary life. Their endurance continued, now expressed through social, domestic, and economic strategies rather than maritime skill or combat. Work became another channel for adaptation and influence. Skills honed at sea, cooking, sewing, basic medical knowledge, trade acumen, and practical problem-solving found application in urban and coastal economies. Taverns, boarding houses, laundries, markets, and trades offered opportunities for livelihood. Yet visibility carried risk. Being too competent, assertive, or noticeable could provoke suspicion or social scrutiny. Women had to carefully balance skill with discretion, blending into ordinary life while subtly shaping the communities around them. Their influence, quiet but persistent, often passed unnoticed in oral tradition, household practices, and professional interactions. Psychological endurance remained essential. Vigilance, careful observation, and social perception, skills necessary aboard pirate ships, remained crucial on land. Communities judged quickly, rumors circulated, and a single misstep could destabilize hard-won stability. Women applied lessons learned at sea, reading human behavior, anticipating conflict, negotiating outcomes, and remaining discreet. Adaptation became second nature. Survival depended on subtlety, intelligence, and the ability to navigate both visible and invisible social dynamics. Meanwhile, myth and legend obscured reality. The stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read were amplified through literature, theater, and later cinema.
Adventure replaced endurance. Danger became excitement. Fear became thrill. The countless unnamed women whose survival required intelligence, strategy, and subtlety were largely erased from history. Yet their influence persisted quietly, shaping households, communities, trades, and even maritime culture over generations. These women left legacies that were invisible but enduring, not in stories of heroism or spectacle, but in practical resilience, strategic thinking, and adaptive intelligence. Age, circumstance, and social background played significant roles. Pirate mythology favors youth, glamour, and daring rebellion, but reality was more complex. Women aboard ships ranged widely in age and experience. Some were older, some had endured hardship before boarding, some were mothers or widows. Many were pushed into maritime spaces by poverty, social displacement, or marginalization rather than choice. Survival depended on strategic adaptability, careful observation, and subtle management of social and environmental dynamics. Endurance, intelligence, and discretion determined whether a woman survived or disappeared into obscurity. Life at sea was unrelenting. Crowding, filth, disease, vermin, spoiled food, exposure to storms, and constant labor made daily existence a struggle. Injuries were treated crudely. Privacy was non-existent. Pregnancy and biological vulnerability added further complexity. Women navigated these physical challenges while simultaneously negotiating social hierarchies, power dynamics, and male temperaments. Survival required continuous vigilance, strategy, and endurance. The mundane horrors of life at sea, combined with social and biological pressures, created an environment in which adaptability was the only reliable form of defense. Relationships aboard ships were rarely simple. Protection from captains or officers could be life-saving but temporary. Male allies were unreliable. Alliances shifted with authority, chance, and temperament. Dependence could quickly become danger. Women had to anticipate outcomes, read moods, and respond strategically. Subtlety, intelligence, and discretion often mattered more than combat skill or force. Those who survived did so through a combination of careful observation, adapted strategy, and invisibility. Returning to land posed additional challenges. Societies were unprepared to recognize the extraordinary endurance of women who had survived piracy. Skills that saved lives at sea, observation, negotiation, patience, strategic thinking, were often undervalued or invisible. Women applied these abilities in new ways, managing households, navigating trades, blending into communities, and preserving their own safety and autonomy. Endurance persisted, now expressed in social, domestic, and economic strategy rather than direct confrontation or maritime expertise. Over time, myths of pirate women eclipsed reality. Adventure, rebellion, and glamour replaced endurance, subtlety, and strategic survival. The countless unnamed women who survived quietly, adapted continuously, and influenced communities vanished from record. Yet their lessons persisted, embedded in the skills, wisdom, and resilience they carried into new environments. Heroism in these cases was quiet, indirect, and uncelebrated, yet it shaped the world around them in profound ways. Ultimately, the rarity of pirate women was not due to incapacity or lack of courage. The environment of piracy, ships, storms, disease, violence, and social constraints filtered for endurance, intelligence, and adaptability. Women bore additional burdens, yet survived through strategy, discretion, and subtlety. Their survival challenges traditional narratives of heroism, demonstrating that endurance, adaptability, and invisibility can constitute extraordinary achievement. As we drift to the close of this narrative, the ships dissolve completely, the waves flatten, and the quiet of endurance prevail. Pirate women endured, adapted, and survived. Their hidden influence persists, faint but undeniable, teaching lessons about resilience, intelligence, and the extraordinary power of quiet survival. In their shadows lies a truth rarely acknowledged: surviving against impossible odds, unseen and uncelebrated, is itself greatness.
All right, let's drift again, slowly, steadily, letting the memory of the sea settle completely, yet following the invisible threads of influence that pirate women wove through history. Because survival was only the first act. What comes after, the quiet impact, the subtle shaping of societies, the ways in which these women carried lessons from the chaos of piracy into ordinary life, is where the story deepens. These women, though often unseen, left enduring marks that shaped families, trades, communities, and maritime culture, echoes that continue long after the ships and cannon fire vanished. When pirate women returned to land, they faced societies unprepared to understand or value their skills. At sea, they had mastered observation, navigation, problem-solving, leadership under stress, and social negotiation. They had endured fear, disease, overcrowding, storms, and the capriciousness of hierarchical authority. Yet on land, these abilities were largely invisible. Communities demanded conformity, obedience, and social propriety. Skills that ensured survival on a pirate ship, strategic thinking, patience, observation, resilience, were now applied in domestic, economic, and social spheres, where recognition was minimal and discretion paramount. Discretion became the cornerstone of survival on land. Many women crafted narratives to protect themselves: widowhood, shipwreck, misfortune, forced travel. Marriage offered additional legitimacy, a home, and social acceptance. Often, the past was completely erased from public memory, buried beneath domestic work, labor, and social engagement. Survival required the quiet performance of ordinariness. Their endurance continued, now expressed not in battles or escapes, but through social intelligence, discretion, and adaptability. These were invisible strategies of survival as remarkable as any daring feat at sea. Work offered another avenue for influence and adaptation. Skills honed aboard ships, sewing, cooking, basic medical knowledge, trade expertise, problem-solving, found application in taverns, boarding houses, laundries, markets, and trades. Yet visibility was delicate. Excessive competence, assertiveness, or notice could provoke suspicion, gossip, or danger. Women had to balance skill with discretion, subtly shaping households, businesses, and communities while blending into ordinary life. Their influence persisted quietly, transmitted through daily practices, shared knowledge, and subtle shifts in social norms, rather than through written history or legend. Psychological endurance remained crucial. Vigilance, social perception, and anticipation, skills essential aboard ships, were indispensable on land. Communities judged quickly, rumors circulated, missteps could destabilize stability painstakingly built. Women applied lessons learned from crews, captains, storms, and constant threat, reading human behavior, anticipating outcomes, negotiating risk, and remaining discreet. Adaptation became instinctive, survival dependent on subtlety, intelligence, and careful management of perception. Endurance had taken a new form, but its essence remained unchanged. Meanwhile, myths and legends increasingly overshadowed reality. Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and a few other named women were transformed into symbols of daring adventure, rebellion, and glamour. Danger became thrill, fear became excitement, endurance became spectacle.
thousands of unnamed women who had survived through intelligence, strategy, and subtlety vanished from historical record. Yet their quiet influence persisted, shaping households, trades, and maritime culture over generations. Their heroism, indirect and uncelebrated, left traces in the skills, knowledge, and resilience passed down to descendants and communities. Age, circumstance, and social position shaped experience. Pirate mythology favors youth and glamour, yet real women ranged widely. Some were older, some had endured hardship before boarding, some were mothers or widows. Many entered maritime life through necessity, poverty, or displacement rather than choice. Survival depended on strategic intelligence, adaptability, and careful navigation of social and environmental hazards. Endurance, subtlety, and discretion determined survival more than bravery or spectacle. The invisible labor of adaptation was relentless and ongoing. Life at sea was unyielding. Crowding, filth, disease, vermin, exposure to storms, and constant labor made daily existence arduous. Injuries were crudely treated, privacy was non-existent, pregnancy and biological vulnerability added complexity. Women navigated these physical, social, and psychological hazards simultaneously. Survival demanded continuous vigilance, strategy, and patience, with every day presenting challenges that required intelligence, subtlety, and endurance. The mundane realities of piracy contrasted sharply with the romanticized myths of adventure, showing survival as practical, quiet, and demanding. Relationships aboard ships were delicate. Companionship with captains or officers offered protection and resources, but was temporary. Male allies were unreliable. Alliances shifted with authority, luck, or temperament. Dependence could rapidly become danger. Women survived by observing, anticipating, and responding strategically. Subtlety, intelligence, and discretion were often more important than combat skill. Those who survived mastered social dynamics, utility, and invisibility above all. Returning to land presented its own challenges. Societies were ill-prepared to recognize the endurance and skills women carried from pirate life. Observation, patience, negotiation, and strategic thinking were undervalued, invisible, or suppressed. Women applied these abilities in domestic, economic, and communal contexts, maintaining survival and autonomy while blending seamlessly into ordinary life. Adaptation persisted, expressed now in social intelligence and strategic invisibility rather than through direct confrontation or maritime skill. Over time, myth further obscured reality. Stories of pirate women as fearless adventurers overshadowed subtle heroism. Daring, glamour, and rebellion replaced strategic survival and endurance. Yet the legacies of countless unnamed women persisted in quiet ways, shaping households, influencing communities, transmitting knowledge, and subtly altering social norms. Heroism, indirect and uncelebrated, remained evident in the skills and resilience passed down from one generation to the next. Ultimately, the rarity of pirate women was not due to lack of courage or ability. The environment of piracy, ships, storms, disease, violence, and social constraints filtered for endurance, intelligence, and adaptability. Women bore additional burdens, but survived through strategy, discretion, and subtlety. Their survival challenges conventional narratives of heroism, proving that endurance, adaptation, and invisibility can constitute extraordinary achievement. As we drift to the close, the ships dissolve, the waves flatten, and the echoes of pirate women linger. They endured chaos, danger, and uncertainty. They survived unseen, uncelebrated, yet profoundly influential. Their stories, fragmentary and quiet, leave subtle imprints on history, reminders that courage is not always visible, heroism not always recognized, and survival itself is remarkable. Let the sea settle completely, the wind vanish, and the quiet of endurance prevail. Pirate women endured, adapted, and survived. Their invisible influence persists, faint but undeniable, teaching lessons about resilience, intelligence, and the extraordinary power of subtle survival. In their shadows lies a truth rarely acknowledged. Enduring impossible odds, unseen and uncelebrated, is itself greatness.
All right, let's drift one last time, slowly, gently, letting the sea flatten completely, the wind die down, and the chaos of pirate life dissolve into memory. And yet, even as the ships vanish into history, the echoes of the women who navigated them persist, almost imperceptibly, like faint ripples across a calm ocean. This is the final reflection on their lives, not just survival, not just myth, but the enduring traces they left behind, the quiet ways they shaped the world, and the subtle lessons their resilience teaches us today. By the time these women returned to land, they had already endured experiences few could imagine: crowding, filth, disease, vermin, spoiled food, storms, injury, constant labor and biological vulnerability. Pregnancy, menstruation, and limited privacy were everyday realities. They navigated complex social hierarchies, shifting alliances, and unpredictable male temperaments, all while performing work critical to survival aboard ships. Each day required vigilance, intelligence, and subtlety, with errors often proving fatal. And yet, despite this relentless strain, they survived, often unnoticed, uncelebrated, and unrecorded. Their endurance was quiet but extraordinary. Returning to land was another form of challenge. Societies were unprepared to recognize, much less reward, the skills these women carried. Navigation, observation, strategic thinking, medical knowledge, negotiation, endurance. These abilities were crucial at sea, but largely invisible on land. Discretion became paramount. Many women crafted narratives of widowhood, misfortune, forced travel, or displacement to protect themselves from suspicion. Marriage offered legitimacy, social acceptance, and a safe identity. In most cases, the past was erased, buried beneath domestic labor, trade, and community obligations. Survival had shifted into the subtle, quiet work of blending in, navigating social expectations, and maintaining autonomy without notice. Work became another avenue of influence. Skills honed at sea, cooking, sewing, herbal knowledge, trade competence, problem-solving, found new expression in taverns, boarding houses, laundries, markets, and other trades. Visibility, however, remained delicate. Being too competent, assertive, or remarkable could provoke suspicion or social scrutiny. Women balanced skill with discretion, subtly shaping households, local economies, and communities while remaining invisible to the broader historical record. Their influence persisted quietly, transmitted through practice, oral knowledge, and subtle shifts in social norms rather than through fame or legend. Psychological endurance was essential. Vigilance, anticipation, and social perception, skills that had kept them alive at sea, remained crucial on land. Communities judged swiftly, gossip traveled fast, and missteps could destabilize the fragile balance they had rebuilt. Women applied lessons learned from dangerous crews, stormy nights, and volatile authority, reading human behavior, anticipating outcomes, negotiating risk, and performing discretion. Adaptation had become instinctive. Survival depended on subtlety, intelligence, and strategic invisibility, now expressed in domestic, economic, and social spheres rather than maritime skill. Meanwhile, myth increasingly overshadowed reality.
Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and a few other named women became symbols of adventure, rebellion, and daring, often with glamour and thrill supplanting endurance, fear, and strategic survival. Thousands of unnamed women who had survived through intelligence, discretion, and subtlety vanished from record, yet their influence persisted, quietly shaping households, communities, and trades over generations. Heroism, indirect and uncelebrated, remained evident in the resilience, intelligence, and strategic adaptability passed to descendants and peers, a subtle but persistent echo of survival. Age, background, and circumstance shaped experience. Myth favors youth and glamour, but reality was more nuanced. Women ranged widely in age and social position. Some were older, some had endured hardship before ever boarding a ship. Some were mothers or widows. Many were forced into maritime life by poverty, displacement, or social marginalization. Survival depended on intelligence, adaptability, discretion, and continuous awareness of shifting hazards rather than daring feats or spectacle. Endurance, subtlety, and careful judgment were critical determinants of survival. Life aboard ships demanded relentless effort. Crowding, filth, disease, vermin, spoiled food, exposure, storms, and constant labor made daily existence arduous. Privacy was near non-existent. Injuries were crudely treated. Biological vulnerability added further layers of risk. Women navigated physical, social, and psychological hazards simultaneously. Survival required continuous vigilance, intelligence, and endurance. Each day aboard was a lesson of subtlety, calculation, and persistence, a form of heroism largely invisible to history. Relationships were complex and precarious. Protection from captains or officers offered temporary security and resources, but was never guaranteed. Alliances within the crew were unpredictable, shifting with authority, luck, and temperament. Dependence could swiftly become danger. Women survived through observation, anticipation, and strategic responses. Subtlety, intelligence, and discretion often outweighed combat skill. Those who endured mastered the delicate balance of utility, invisibility, and adaptation, sustaining themselves through constant assessment and calculation. Returning to land posed fresh challenges. Societies often undervalued or ignored the extraordinary skills and endurance these women had developed. Observation, patience, negotiation, and strategic thinking became tools for survival in domestic, economic, and communal life. Adaptation persisted, now expressed in social intelligence and careful invisibility rather than maritime skill or direct confrontation. The quiet heroism of these women remained unrecorded but enduring, shaping households, communities, and cultural practices for generations. Over time, myth and legend obscured reality further. Romanticized tales of fearless pirate women overshadowed the subtler heroism of the countless unnamed women who had survived, adapted, and influenced their worlds. Daring, glamour, and rebellion replaced strategy, endurance, and discretion in popular memory. Yet the lessons of these lives persisted invisibly. Resilience, intelligence, strategic adaptability, and subtle influence were transmitted across families, communities, and trades. Heroism was quiet, indirect, and persistent, leaving traces that history seldom documents but never entirely erase. Ultimately, the rarity of pirate women was not due to lack of courage or ability. The environment of piracy, storms, disease, overcrowding, violence, and social constraints filtered for endurance, intelligence, and adaptation. Women bore additional burdens, yet many survived through strategy, discretion, and careful calculation. Their survival challenges conventional narratives of heroism, showing that endurance, adaptability, and invisibility can constitute extraordinary achievement. As we drift to the end of this long narrative, the ships dissolve, the waves flatten, and the echoes of pirate women linger quietly. They endured chaos, threat, and uncertainty. They survived unseen, uncelebrated, yet profoundly influential. Their stories, fragmentary and subtle, leave lasting imprints on history, reminders that courage is not always visible, heroism not always recognized, and survival itself is remarkable. Let the sea settle entirely, the wind vanish, and the quiet of endurance prevail. Pirate women endured, adapted, and survived. Their hidden influence persists, faint but undeniable, teaching lessons about resilience, intelligence, and the extraordinary power of subtle, persistent survival. In their shadows lies a truth rarely acknowledged. Surviving impossible odds, unseen and uncelebrated, is itself greatness.